We've been looking at this part of the world for, well, really since the start of the class. At the very start of the class, we talked about the prehistoric period, but then let me get my pen up here. Then we went and talked about ancient Mesopotamia over here. We spent some time talking about ancient Egypt down here. We spent some time talking about Athens and the Athenian tradition up here. We spent some time talking about Jerusalem and the Hebrew tradition over here. We spent some time talking about Rome, the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire, and that's what you have a map of on your screen there, a map of the Roman Empire. Well, we've been talking about this part of the world for quite a while, and something happens in this part of the world that we've actually come up to a couple of times, and then backed off and went off and talked about something else. Not a very pleasant topic, I guess, but civilization. Civilization comes to a crashing halt in this part of the world. The whole thing collapses. And the starting point for this presentation is with an event that traditionally historians have called the fall of Rome. The collapse of the Roman Empire. The fall of Rome, and the traditional date that historians have given the fall of Rome, roughly 476. But that's just a date which has gotten stuck to the collapse of the empire. You know, it all didn't happen in 1 year. It's a several hundred-year-long story. And in a world history course where we talk about military things and political things and economic things and legal things, the fall of Rome is a big story in that course, and we'd probably spend an entire week just talking about the fall of Rome, the collapse of the Roman Empire. It's a big event. But for us in this course, there's really only one part of that story which touches on our story in this course, and that is that part of the story, and just a part of the story, of the collapse of the Roman Empire is a series of invasions. The barbarian invasions. The invasions of the barbarians. The barbarians come sweeping out of Central Asia. Let me give you this map here. Out of roughly where Mongolia is today, northern China is today, all those Stan states, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, roughly out of this area here, comes sweeping out of Central Asia, crossing the very flat lands of Russia, what we call Russia today, entering into Europe, launching a series of invasions across the very flat lands of Russia into Europe. Or on this map, coming in, invading Roman Europe, and as a result of all the other weaknesses the empire has that we're not going to go into in this course, the entire empire collapses. The whole thing falls apart. These barbarians come out of Central Asia. I've got a map here which is similar to what you have on page 32 in your textbook, similar at least, showing the different routes of various barbarian groups. They come out of the same place. They all speak similar languages to each other. They worship the same gods. They tell the same stories about the gods. They have the same kind of legal codes. They're all related to each other in some way. But at different times we give them different names. We talk about the Huns and the Goths and the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths and the Vandals and the Vikings and the Lombards and the Burgundians and the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes and the Franks, and there's a whole bunch of these different groups. They're all related to each other, but at different times, different groups come sweeping into Europe, and as a result, the whole thing collapses. The whole thing falls apart. The barbarians. You probably have an image in your mind of barbarians sweeping into Europe, and pretty scary guys, huh? Almost like a big Capital One commercial sweeping across Western Europe, and it's fun to make fun of, but it's a pretty tough time for an awful lot of people. Imagine if the Capital One commercial was real and they were really running through the streets and really killing people and not just making fun of the idea. Well, it's a pretty scary time and a pretty tough time for an awful lot of people. And as a result of the barbarian invasions, civilization comes to an end in a big part of this part of the world. By this time in the course, you've learned what I mean when I say civilization within the context of this course. People who live in cities, or at least where the city is important to them, and where they at least have access to a written language. And those two things, cities and literacy, reading and writing, those two things disappear from a big part of this part of the world. The first part of this equation is easy to figure out. People stop living in cities. Why? Because that's where the barbarians are headed. The only reason why these barbarians are coming all the way from Central Asia is to burn stuff and steal stuff. I mean, that's what barbarians do. If you're applying for a job as a barbarian, you have to have burning stuff and stealing stuff on your resume, because that's what they're interested in hiring. Burning stuff and stealing stuff. And, well, the place to go to steal stuff is the cities. That's where the cool stuff is. You don't get any merit badges in the Viking Club for, stealing beans out of a bean field or something. The cool stuff to steal is in the cities. And, well, the people living in the cities figured out pretty fast that if you wanted to avoid the barbarians, and who wouldn't, well, then, you avoid the cities. And the big urban areas of Rome are just turned to ghost towns, just abandoned, empty streets, empty buildings, because everybody's trying to get away from where the barbarians are headed. And as the people in the city filter out into the countryside and settle down into little societies, keeping their heads down, not trying to make much noise, not trying to get much attention, not trying to attract the barbarians over. As life settles down for them, well, are they more interested in teaching their children how to read and write, or in how to plant and harvest beans? What kind of animals you can eat, what kinds you can't eat, what kind of plants you can eat, what kind of plants you can't eat, how to hunt, how to dress game, how to fish, how to survive. Because as important as reading and writing is, there's only so much, there are things that are more important than surviving. There's more important things than reading and writing, like surviving, like finding food. And even if we did even if they did teach their kids how to read and write, what would they have to read? On the ways out of town, when the Vikings showed up, let's just say, the books are all left behind. You got to get out of town in a hurry. And the books have all been burned up. And even if there are books that are around, how long would they survive in a humid environment like the Mediterranean world? Or for that matter, like Florida, without air conditioning and dehumidifying systems and that kind of thing. Because books don't last very long, not in a humid environment like the Mediterranean world or like Florida. Leave your notebook out in your shed in your backyard, and how many years would it be before it was just completely worthless? Excuse me. Moth-eaten, bug-eaten, worm-eaten, mildewed shut. It would be completely useless. And you see, in the ancient world, there's only two ways to keep a book alive. Either you take a copy of the book and you seal it up in a clay jar. Believe it or not, that's how we found most literature from the ancient world. So you always have a copy to protect it from mildew and bugs, but then you can't read it. If you want a copy that you can read, you have to keep making new copies. And constantly as you're reading a book, you're also copying out the book. And living under the conditions that I've outlined for you, how much time do you have to devote to copying books? And within just a couple of generations, the books are all gone. Reading and writing has disappeared from a big part of this part of the world. And Western Europe collapses into what's called the Dark Ages. It's dark. Well, these ages are called the Dark Ages for a couple of reasons, for two reasons. For one reason, it's a dark time for an awful lot of people. A tough time for an awful lot of people. That's one reason why they're called dark. But they're also dark to us today. We don't know very much about the Dark Ages. That's because these people have lost the ability to write down their stories for us. At the start of the semester, we talked about prehistoric people, people before they've developed a written language. Now we're talking about a post-historic people, people who've lost the ability to write down their story. And hundreds of years go by where there's really not an awful lot for us to say. We don't know an awful lot about the Dark Ages because there's very, very, very few people who are able to write down their stories for us. And so in this course we pass over several hundred years where there's really not much to say. That is pretty much the case for this part of what had been the Roman Empire. Pretty much the case for what had been pretty much the case for this part of the world, except for one place in this part of the world that was never even in the Roman Empire. a place that not even the barbarians would go, because hardly anybody lived there. There's nothing there to go all the way over there to burn and steal stuff. Very few people lived there. And that's right here on the map. Right along the west coast of Ireland. A place that's so cold and wet and rainy, windy, rocky. Hardly anybody lived there. It's a pretty place, but hardly anybody lived there. You wouldn't want to live there today without modern conveniences. A very tough place to live. On the screen I'm showing another map of the British Isles, and again we're talking about roughly this part of the world down here. A part of Ireland, a place which had never even been a part of the Roman Empire. And very few people lived in this part of Ireland. In fact, just about the only people who lived there, just about the only people, were people who lived there on purpose, because hardly anybody lived there. People who wanted to live away from the ordinary, everyday world, to devote themselves to spiritual exercises, to prayer, scripture reading, that kind of thing. In other words, monks and nuns. There's a string of monasteries along the west coast of Ireland, some of them right on the coastline, some of them on small islands just off the coastline. You have some photographs of some Irish monasteries, or I think just one Irish monastery on page 39 in your textbook you can look at. Outside of these monasteries, there's not a lot of people around. And there's nothing there for the barbarians to go and to steal. And eventually, these people, the monks and nuns living in these monasteries, come to realize something. They're the last people in this part of the world who know how to read and write. Everybody else has forgotten. And so they're going to work into their daily schedule, sitting in those little huts you see on page 39 of your textbook. Every day they're going to work into their schedule. They're going to read something so they don't forget how to read. They're going to write something so they don't forget how to write. They're going to copy books so that they don't lose the books they have. Teams of monks are going to leave the monastery, head out into what had been the Roman Empire, and collect as many books as they can find and bring them back to be copied and preserved, because someday, they think, civilization might come back to this part of the world. Someday, people in this part of the world might want to know the knowledge of the past, the science, the technology, the medical knowledge, the philosophy, the theology, the literature, just their own story of their ancestors, that they would want to know the history, the knowledge of the past. And hundreds of years go by, and these monks and nuns keeping reading and writing in the Latin language alive in this part of the world. Meanwhile, the rest of Western Europe slips into those dark ages, and hundreds of years go by where there's really not much for us to say. Again, that's pretty much the story of this part of what had been the Roman Empire. It's a very different story for the eastern part of what had been the Roman Empire. This part of what had been the Roman Empire, well, there's a very different story. That's because there's a series of mountain ranges coming through here. Well, actually, yeah, up through here, down through here. Mountain ranges there, and starting about here, desert. The barbarians who come in out of Central Asia, sweeping in across where Russia is today, kind of bounce off these mountains and come back over, you see, kind of bounce off those mountains and come into this part of the Europe, of Western Europe, running around, burning stuff, stealing stuff, killing people. Meanwhile, this part of what had been the Roman Empire, let me get rid of that stuff. For this part of what had been the Roman Empire, there's a very different story, and that story is going to be covered in the next online session.